The alarm on Clara Thorne's phone went off at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was scheduled to, because the mattress spring that had been poking through the fabric for 6 months had finally given up pretending it wouldn't wake her. She lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of their apartment, the one shaped, if you tilted your head and squinted through optimism, like a rabbit. Lily had named it Gerald. Gerald was the one constant in their lives that didn't require rent. Clara sat up, moving slowly so the bed frame wouldn't groan and wake her sister. The wooden floor was cold through her sock, singular, because the left one had developed a hole large enough to be called a skylight, and she hadn't had time to mend it. She pressed her bare heel to the floor and absorbed the cold like a penance, then padded to the kitchen to start the coffee. Free jobs. Today was a free job day. The bakery shift started at 5:30, 4 blocks away, which meant she needed to leave in 20 minutes. She would finish there at 10, take the subway to the hotel, where she cleaned rooms from 11 to 4, and then, if she was lucky and her feet didn't completely stage a revolt, she'd make it to the evening shift at Harlow's restaurant by 5:30. She'd be home by midnight. Lily would already be asleep, having been picked up from school by Mrs. Papadopoulos downstairs, who accepted the gesture of a fresh loaf of sourdough every Friday as payment. Clara moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to be quiet and fast and invisible. She made coffee in the second-hand machine that gurgled like it was arguing with itself. She packed Lily's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple she'd polished on her shirt, and 3 crackers arranged in a smiley face because Lily always checked, and the smiley face made her actually eat them. Then she stopped at the small sewing table wedged between the refrigerator and the wall. The yellow dress was folded on it, finished. Clara sat down slowly, her coffee warming her hands, and looked at it. She'd been working on it for 3 weeks, in the 10-minute pockets of time that existed between exhaustion and sleep. It had started as one of their mother's old blouses, soft yellow cotton, cheerful despite its age, and a skirt panel cut from a sundress that had been beyond repair. The sewing was not perfect. The seams showed a slight wobble near the left hip where she'd run out of thread at 1 in the morning and had to reknot. Her fingers had bled twice. Once when she'd pushed the needle through a doubled seam, and once when, nodding off, she'd pinched herself awake. But the dress was beautiful. Oak Ridge Academy's open house was today. Every child was expected to come in their Sunday best, and Lily had been quietly, carefully not mentioning that she didn't have any. The kind of silence Lily used wasn't the silence of a sulking child. It was the silence of an 8-year-old who had learned that wanting things cost other people something, and had therefore decided to stop wanting things loudly. That silence was the thing that broke Clara open every time. She touched the collar of the yellow dress with one fingertip. She'll look like sunshine, Clara thought. She'll walk in there, and she'll look like absolute sunshine. Lily woke at 7 with the serious, bright-eyed energy of a child who treats every day like a problem to be solved. She ate her breakfast, oatmeal, made with the last of the brown sugar, without complaint, and when Clara set the yellow dress on the table beside her bowl, Lily went completely still. "Is that for me?" For today. Clara kept her voice casual, leaning against the counter, watching her sister's face with a hunger she rarely allowed herself to show. For the open house. Lily touched the dress the same way Clara had, with one careful finger. Then she looked up, and her eyes, wide and dark and far too old for 8, were bright with something that was not quite tears. "You made it," Lily said. It wasn't a question. "From Mom's blouse." Clara cleared her throat. "So it's a little bit her too." Lily was out of her chair and wrapped around Clara's waist before the sentence was fully finished, her face pressed into her sister's stomach, her small hands fisted in the back of Clara's uniform shirt. Clara held her, chin resting on the top of her head, and closed her eyes. "You're going to be the best-dressed girl there," Clara murmured. Lily's voice was muffled. "I'm going to be the only girl there whose dress is made of love." Clara laughed, and the sound surprised her, real and full and unguarded. "That is the most embarrassing thing you've ever said." "I know," said Lily, still not letting go. "I mean it anyway." The hallways of Oak Ridge Academy smelled like money, the specific scent of fresh paint over old wood, of lilies arranged too perfectly in crystal vases, of the kind of institutional confidence that only comes from a century of endowment funds. The school's motto was carved in Latin above the main entrance: nurturing excellence in every child. It had been carved, Clara had always privately noted, in a font that suggested some children's excellence was more worth nurturing than others. Lily walked beside her through the lobby, her hand tucked in Clara's, her patent leather shoes, bought secondhand, polished to a mirror's shine, clicking on the marble. She wore the yellow dress. She looked, exactly as Clara had hoped, like sunshine. Mrs. Agatha Higgins stood at the entrance to the main hall, directing traffic with the imperious calm of a woman who has spent 3 decades deciding which children were worthy of her attention. She was 60-something in manner if not in age, draped in a blazer that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent, and her eyes moved over the arriving families with the automated precision of an appraiser sorting antiques from junk. They landed on Lily. They stayed there one beat too long. Clara felt it, the specific quality of that look, the way it categorized and dismissed simultaneously, and tightened her hand around Lily's. She had 3 jobs and a dead mattress spring and a jacket with a broken zipper she'd safety pin shut, and she was used to being looked at like this by women like Agatha Higgins. What she was not, would never be, accustomed to was her sister being looked at this way. Miss Thorne. Higgins's voice was perfectly pleasant, in the way that perfectly pleasant voices so often aren't. How nice. And Lily. A pause, the length of a held breath. What an interesting dress. Thank you, said Lily, with the grave courtesy of a child performing good manners for a specific reason. Higgins smiled. It didn't reach her eyes, which had already moved on to the Ashworth family arriving behind them. The Ashworths, whose last name was on the science wing. It happened an hour later. The open house was in full swing in the main hall. Parents circling student displays. Teachers performing warmth for families whose annual donations funded that warmth. Clara had left to retrieve her phone from the car, leaving Lily in the hall under the watch of a classroom aide. She had been gone, she would later calculate, 11 minutes. The Ashworth girl, Peyton, 9 years old and already fluent in the language of superiority, had decided that her display should be the focal point of the hall. Lily's papier-mâché science project, a small, carefully painted model of the solar system with handwritten labels and Lily's careful, earnest printing, was sitting on the adjacent table. That's so sad, Peyton announced to the gathered parents and children, her voice carrying. It looks like it was made by a kindergartner. Lily said nothing. She stood beside her solar system with her hands folded, looking at the middle distance, performing the kind of invisible that she'd had practice at. Mrs. Higgins appeared at Peyton's shoulder. Later, Clara would ask herself what exactly had gone through Higgins's mind in that moment, whether it was cruelty calculated or cruelty casual, the kind that doesn't even require a motive, that simply reaches for power because power is there. Perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps, with the Ashworths watching and approving donations to be discussed, Agatha Higgins simply chose the audience she wanted to please. Lily. Her voice was soft, carrying. I'm afraid your dress is quite inappropriate for an event of this caliber. Oak Ridge has standards. Lily looked at her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Higgins. That fabric. Higgins reached out and took the skirt between 2 fingers, lifting it slightly as though inspecting something found on the sidewalk. This is homemade, isn't it? This is repurposed fabric. She said the word with delicate horror, as though Lily were wearing something salvaged from a dumpster rather than a garment made with love and bleeding hands and 3 weeks of stolen minutes. We cannot have this representing the school at an open house. It sends quite the wrong message to our parent community. The Ashworth mother was watching. 3 other parents were watching. A cluster of children had gone quiet. Lily's voice was very small. My sister made it. Your sister, said Higgins, should have known better. And then, in a motion so swift and deliberate it seemed rehearsed, she took hold of the dress's collar seam and pulled. The sound of tearing fabric was louder than the thunder beginning to rumble outside. The seam Clara had sewn at 1 a.m, by lamplight, with re-knotted thread and bleeding fingers. The seam split clean down the left side, and the skirt panel, the piece cut from their mother's sundress, pulled away and came off in Higgins's hand. Lily made no sound. She stood completely still. Shocked, maybe. Or perhaps it was something older than shock. The paralysis of a child who has learned that making a sound when something hurts only makes the pain last longer. Higgins looked at the piece of fabric in her hand. She walked to the side door, opened it, and dropped it into the mud of the courtyard outside, where the sky had opened and the rain was now falling hard. "You'll wait outside," she said, "until your guardian comes to fetch you. We'll find you something appropriate to wear, or you won't be attending the remainder of the event." She stepped back inside and closed the door, and Lily, because she had no other option, stepped out into the rain. She stood on the edge of the porch for a moment. Then she stepped off it, into the courtyard, picked up the torn piece of her mother's sundress from the mud, pressed it against her chest, and stood in the rain and shook. She didn't cry right away. She held on to the knot, crying the way you hold your breath before a drop. And then a parent on the dry porch, a woman in a camel coat who had watched the entire thing, laughed, said something behind her hand to the woman beside her, and they both laughed. Lily put her face down and wept. No one on the porch heard the helicopter coming until it was almost on top of them. The roar split the afternoon open. The oak trees on the school's east lawn buckled under the downdraft, flinging leaves like scattered cards. The rain changed direction. Windows rattled. Heads turned. The helicopter was matte black, sleek, and enormous. The kind of aircraft that communicated its owner's net worth without needing a logo. It settled onto the school's pristine center lawn with the unhurried authority of something that has never been told it wasn't allowed to land there, because nothing and no one has ever tried to stop it. The cabin door slid open. A single pair of custom Italian leather shoes stepped into the mud. Julian Vance unfolded himself from the cabin with the deliberate economy of a man who moves through the world as though it is perpetually in his way, then pauses, because even Julian Vance, in the middle of his ruthless, forward-driving, acquisition-driven day, paused. He had been in a meeting 20 minutes ago. He had a school board director on the phone and a term sheet in his briefcase, and exactly no intention of spending more than 40 minutes at Oak Ridge Academy before moving on to his next appointment in downtown Seattle. The school was a real estate play, old building, premium zip code, outdated governance structure. He would acquire it, modernize it, and move on. That had been the plan. His cold eyes, the pale gray of a winter sky, swept the courtyard and found the small figure in the rain. The child was 8 years old, maybe. She wore a yellow dress that had been torn nearly to ruin. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, pressing a wet piece of fabric against her chest like it was something precious, or like it was all she had left. Her hair was soaked flat. Her shoes were filling with water. She was not asking for anyone's attention. She was not performing her distress. She simply stood in the rain and cried, quietly, in the particular way of a child who has learned that no one is coming. Julian had stood exactly like that once. He had been 7 years old, and it had not been rain but a February snowstorm, and it had not been a school courtyard but the back steps of a house in Providence where the Millers, his third foster placement, had locked him out for breaking a dinner plate. He had stood in the snow for 4 hours because he had been afraid that knocking would make things worse. The memory moved through him like an electrical current. His jaw locked. The muscle in his cheek, the one Marcus had learned to read like a weather vane, tightened. He turned his gaze to the porch, where a cluster of well-dressed adults were watching the child with the casual disinterest of people watching something unpleasant from behind glass. And his expression went very still in a way that, in any boardroom, would have caused experienced executives to quietly start calculating their exit routes. His assistant Marcus Sterling appeared at his elbow. He had descended from the helicopter a half step behind Julian, as always, notebook in hand, reading his employer's face with 17 years of well-compensated experience. "Who?" Julian's voice cut through the sound of the storm like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. "Did this to her?" Mrs. Higgins had been performing graciousness for 30 years, and she was very good at it. The moment the helicopter landed and the murmur went through the crowd, "Julian Vance. It's Julian Vance. The Julian Vance." She had smoothed her blazer and begun composing her smile, warm, deferential, professionally honored. She crossed the lobby toward the main entrance. She had her hand extended before she'd fully opened the door. "Mr. Vance, what an extraordinary surprise. We had no idea you'd be arriving personally. The board usually, your name." He said it without looking at her. He was still looking at the child in the courtyard. Higgins blinked. Pardon me? Your name." Now he looked at her. The smile she had prepared took one look at his eyes and quietly dissolved. "What is your name?" "Agatha Higgins." "I'm the senior, Mrs. Higgins." He said it the way you say a verdict. You put that child out in the rain. Higgins felt the air around him change before she could formulate a response. A drop in atmospheric pressure that was entirely psychological but completely real. She had navigated 30 years of volatile parents and impatient board members, and she had never, in any of those encounters, experienced anything quite like the focused stillness of Julian Vance's anger. It was not loud. It was heavy. The child's attire was inappropriate for the "take off your jacket." Higgins stopped. "I beg your jacket." His voice didn't rise. "Take it off and give it to that child. Now." On the porch, not a single person spoke. Peyton Ashworth's mother had gone very still, her champagne flute half raised. Higgins looked around, at the watching parents, at the school's principal, Dr. Crane, who had materialized in the doorway with the pallor of a man watching an unavoidable collision. And then, because the weight of Julian Vance's gaze was a genuinely physical thing, she took off her blazer. It was irrelevant, in the end. Julian had already removed his own jacket, a charcoal cashmere and wool blend that had been tailored in Milan at a cost that would have covered Clara's rent for 4 months. And he was crossing the courtyard in his shirt sleeves, rain immediately soaking into the fabric, moving toward Lily with a purposefulness that did not waver. He crouched down in front of her. He was eye level with her this way. She looked up at him, this small, drenched, shaking creature, and her expression was the careful, watchful look of a child who has learned not to trust sudden kindness from strangers because it so rarely is. "Hey," he said. His voice, with her, was different, quiet and unperformed in a way it never was in any boardroom. "I've got you." He wrapped his jacket around her. It swallowed her. She vanished into it like something returning to warmth, and the unconscious sound she made, a small, unguarded exhale of relief, traveled from Julian's chest straight to whatever the frozen thing inside him was and pressed against it. He straightened, turned, and looked at Agatha Higgins. "Dr. Crane," he said, without raising his voice. "Come here." The principal obeyed. He had not meant to obey. He had meant to handle this diplomatically, but his feet crossed the porch before his mind issued the instruction. "Mrs. Higgins," Julian said, with the precision of a man issuing a legally binding statement, "will be removed from this institution by end of business today. She will receive no severance. She will receive no letter of recommendation. If I find that she has been permitted to resign rather than being terminated for cause, I will have my legal team contact every school in this district and provide them with a detailed account of what she did to an 8-year-old child this afternoon." He paused. "Am I understood?" Dr. Crane's mouth opened. He was a man accustomed to having opinions on things like this. "If she is still employed by this school by 5 o'clock this evening," Julian continued, with the gentle calm of a man for whom ultimatums are simply accurate statements of future fact, "I will purchase this building, this institution, and the ground it stands on. I will dissolve the board. I will sell the real estate for development. And Oak Ridge Academy will become a parking structure." He looked at Dr. Crane. "I have been planning to buy it for other reasons. This simply changes the timeline and the motive." Dr. Crane looked at Higgins. Higgins looked at her blazer, still draped over her arm, and said nothing. "Termination letter," said Julian, "before 5. He walked back to the child. 30 minutes later, Lily was sitting in the school's administrative office, wrapped in Julian's jacket, with a cup of hot chocolate that Marcus had materialized from somewhere. Marcus was supernaturally good at materializing things, warming her hands. The torn piece of yellow fabric was on the table in front of her. She hadn't let go of it. Julian sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, shirt sleeves wet. He watched her with his hands loosely clasped and said nothing, because he didn't know how to talk to children, had never had occasion to learn, had avoided children with the same careful deliberateness with which he avoided airports at Christmas and charity galas, and because sometimes, he had found, silence was the only honest thing to offer. After a while, Lily looked at him from beneath her damp fringe. "Thank you for your jacket," she said, with the precise, genuine courtesy of a child whose manners were not performed but real. "You're welcome. It's very warm." A pause. "It must be expensive." "It doesn't matter." Lily considered this. Clara says things always matter, but she means money. She says pretending things don't cost anything is how rich people stop noticing what things cost for other people. Julian looked at her for a moment. "Your sister is right." "I know." Lily pulled the jacket tighter. "She's usually right. She's very smart. She had to stop going to university, but she's smart. Why did she stop? Because of me, said Lily, with the direct, matter-of-fact honesty of a child who has processed a difficult truth and made her peace with it. When Mom and Dad died, Clara came home and she stopped going. So I could stay in my school and not go into. She paused, choosing words carefully. The system. She didn't want me to go into the system. Julian's jaw tightened. She works 3 jobs, Lily added, in the tone of someone reciting a fact they are proud of and pained by simultaneously. She made my dress so I'd look nice today. She looked down at the torn piece of fabric. She sewed it in the dark so she wouldn't wake me up. I could hear the needle. When I was supposed to be asleep, Julian said nothing. There was nothing to say. He looked at the torn yellow cotton and he thought of a blue winter coat, size 7, that had belonged to the boy at the miller's house before him, and which he had been wearing when he'd slipped in the kitchen and pulled the coat's sleeve against the hot burner. The burn had been minor. The consequence had not been. She worked very hard on it, said Lily. I know, said Julian. I don't think Mrs. Higgins knew that. Julian said, with quiet precision, it wouldn't have mattered if she had. Lily looked at him, a long, considering look. Then she nodded once, with the gravity of someone who has decided something. Okay, she said. Clara arrived 22 minutes later. She came through the front door of the school at something approaching a run, her hair plastered flat by the rain, her canvas jacket soaked through, her face wearing the expression of a person who has received a phone call beginning with "there's been an incident" and has sprinted 4 blocks from the nearest bus stop without pausing to process the details. She found Lily in the administrative office, wrapped in a jacket worth more than their rent, holding a cup of hot chocolate. Sitting across from her was a man Clara didn't immediately recognize, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, radiating the specific composure of someone who has never had to hurry because the world reorganizes itself around his schedule. Clara crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to her knees in front of her sister, her hands going to Lily's face, her eyes running a rapid, terrified inventory. Are you okay? Lily, look at me. Are you hurt? I'm okay, Lily said. Julian has a very warm jacket. Clara straightened slowly and turned to face the man. She recognized him then, the face from headlines, from Forbes covers on magazine racks she'd walked past in hotel lobbies, from the kind of news stories that exist in a different universe from the one where people work 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Julian Vance. The Julian Vance. Her face did not change the way most people's faces changed when they recognized him. There was no flicker of awe or deference or the social recalibration that he had come to expect from almost everyone he encountered. What crossed Clara Thorne's face was something more complex, a rapid, unsentimental assessment, the kind of look a person develops when they've learned, through experience and not cynicism, that generosity from powerful strangers tends to come with terms they can't yet read. She stepped slightly in front of Lily. The gesture was automatic, unconscious, the movement of a body that had spent 3 years arranging itself as a barrier between one small person and the rest of the world. Julian looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, but Marcus, watching from the doorway, noted it. Miss Thorne, Julian said. Mr. Vance. Her voice was steady, controlled. Thank you for keeping my sister warm. I'll take it from here. He insisted on driving them home. Clara refused twice, with the polite, firm language of a person who has had practice declining things that come with hidden costs. Julian declined to be declined, not rudely, but with the implacable persistence of a man who has decided something. It's raining, he said. You came by bus. Lily's already been cold once today. We manage fine. I know you manage fine. There was nothing condescending in it. I'm offering a car. That's all. Clara looked at him for a long moment, the kind of searching look that made most people uncomfortable because it didn't leave much room for pretense. Julian returned it without flinching. He was used to being assessed. He was not used to being assessed quite like this. She took the car, not because she'd softened, the wariness in her eyes didn't diminish, but because Lily was still shivering and pragmatism was one of Clara's most deeply held values. The car was a black SUV the size of a small ship, piloted by a driver named Thomas who moved through Seattle's evening traffic with the uncanny smoothness of someone who has been paid very well for a very long time to get things right. Lily fell asleep in approximately 7 minutes, listing gently against Clara's shoulder Julian's jacket still wrapped around her. Marcus rode in the front. Julian and Clara sat in the back, separated by the sleeping child, and said nothing for a while. She told me about the dress, Julian said finally. She told you. Clara kept her voice even. That you made it. That you sewed it at night. A pause. She heard the needle. Clara looked out the window. The city moved past, storefronts going dark, puddles lit orange by streetlights. Her jaw was set. Mrs. Higgins has been terminated, Julian said. I know. Dr. Crane called me. She won't work in education in this state again. My legal team will make certain of it. Clara turned from the window. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. Then why? Because she put an 8-year-old child in the rain, he said, with a quietness that was somehow more final than volume. For the crime of wearing a dress her sister made her. And I am, he stopped. His jaw worked. I have a certain intolerance for that particular category of cruelty. Something in Clara's posture changed, a fractional softening, like a locked door not opening but acknowledging the knock. Thank you, she said. The words were measured, but they were real. The apartment building came into view 20 minutes later, and Thomas pulled to the curb with his usual professionalism. Julian got out. This surprised Clara, who had expected a polite goodbye from inside the warm vehicle. She had not expected him to follow them in. She hadn't invited him to. She would have said this. She had the words assembled, courteous but clear, except that Julian was already carrying Lily, who had transferred seamlessly from Clara's shoulder to his chest in the way that sleeping children shift between warm bodies without waking, and he was waiting with the patient. Unperformed courtesy of a man who had decided he was going upstairs and was merely allowing Clara the formality of leading the way. She led the way. The elevator was out. It was frequently out. The landlord had a creative relationship with maintenance schedules, so they climbed 3 flights. Julian carried Lily up all 3 without apparent effort and without comment, though Clara watched, from the corner of her eye, the way he took in each detail. The peeling wallpaper in the stairwell, the bare bulb on the second landing, the smell of other people's cooking seeping through thin walls. Their apartment was small and clean with the determined tidiness of a person who cannot control their circumstances but can control their immediate environment. The furniture was second-hand, supplemented by Clara's considerable skill with the sewing machine. The worn armchair recovered in a fabric she'd found at a remnant sale. The curtains made from 2 mismatched sheets that somehow complemented each other. Books stacked in careful towers beside the sofa because they had no shelves. A drawing of the solar system. Lilies, taped to the refrigerator beside a photograph of 2 adults, caught laughing, summer light behind them. Julian set Lily down on the bed in the small room, the only bedroom. He didn't ask where Clara slept, and his eyes found the fold-out couch in the living room without her having to answer, and stepped back. He looked at Lily's room, the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, meticulously arranged in recognizable constellations. The library books stacked on the floor by the bed, the crayon drawings pinned in a neat grid above the dresser. Each one was signed, Love, Clara, and Lily. He turned and went back to the living room, where Clara was standing by the kitchen counter with her arms folded, waiting. She's extraordinary, he said. Yes, said Clara. No performative modesty. Just the word, warm with conviction. So are you. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. Not offended, appraising. Don't what? Don't do the thing where you, she stopped. Start it again. I know how this works. A rich man sees something that moves him and he wants to fix it because fixing things is what powerful people do instead of, she stopped again. Instead of what? She looked at him steadily. I don't know yet, she admitted. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Julian looked at her. This woman, 24 years old, who had folded her own life into a compact form to make room for her sisters, who stood in a too-small apartment in a soaked jacket and looked at him without asking for anything and without pretending to be something she wasn't. She looked at him, and she was the realest thing he had encountered in a very long time. I would like to help, he said. Not fix. Help. I'll think about it, said Clara, which was, from her, more than he'd expected. Marcus, waiting in the hallway where he'd positioned himself with the tact of 17 years of service, watched Julian emerge from the apartment and noted, with the quiet interest of a longtime observer, that his employer's face held an expression he had not seen before. Not the cold satisfaction of a concluded deal, something older, something that didn't have a name in Julian Vance's usual vocabulary. "Marcus," Julian said as they descended the stairs. "Sir, I want everything. Parents, guardians, financial records, school history, the lot. Tonight." "Already started it." Julian stopped on the second landing and looked at him. Marcus shrugged. "I know your face," he said. Agatha Higgins did not go quietly. She went loudly, and she went with a phone, and she had 30 years of social connections to spend. By the following Wednesday, the manager of Harlow's restaurant had called Clara in before her shift, sat her down with the specific, visible discomfort of a man delivering bad news he considers someone else's fault, and informed her that her services were no longer required, effective immediately, something about restructuring, something about shifts being consolidated, and he was very sorry. The reason, delivered with the subtlety of a closed fist, was that Higgins had had dinner with the restaurant's owner the previous evening. Clara walked home in the rain. Again, it seemed to rain consistently in this story of her life, and sat at the kitchen table for exactly 12 minutes, doing the arithmetic. With Harlow's gone, she was down to 2 jobs: the bakery and the hotel. The combined income covered rent, utilities, and groceries if she was careful. It did not cover Lily's school fees, which were due in 6 weeks. Lily's scholarship covered 80%. The remaining 20% had always come from Harlow's. She had, currently, $340 in savings. She put her face in her hands. Not to cry. She didn't cry in the kitchen, not where Lily could come home and find her, but to think, in the dark behind her palms, with the specific focused desperation of someone calculating how to turn a losing hand into a survivable one. She didn't notice, when she looked up, that her phone had 2 missed calls from an unknown number. The call, when she returned it the following morning, was not from a number she recognized. It was from a woman named Elena, who had a crisp, pleasant voice and identified herself as the head of household staffing for Vance Household Services, a subsidiary, she explained, of Vance Industries. They were looking to fill a position: private household manager and chef, live-in, for a primary residence in the Belltown neighborhood. The role encompassed meal preparation, household scheduling, some personal erranding, and overseeing the residence's domestic staff. The package included competitive salary. She named a figure that made Clara go very still: full health and dental benefits for the employee and any immediate dependents, and on-site accommodation in the residence's private guest suite. The guest suite, Clara said carefully, is included. Fully furnished, private entrance, full kitchen. The residence has 5 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms, so there's considerable space. The position would be for you and, we understand, your sister. Clara stared at the water stain on the ceiling. Gerald the rabbit stared back. "Who authorized this job offer?" she asked. A brief pause. "Mr. Julian Vance's office." Clara was quiet for a long time. "Miss Thorne, do you have questions about the—" "I have approximately 15 questions," said Clara. "Is Mr. Vance available?" Julian answered his own phone on the second ring, which Marcus later noted was not something he did for anyone except Clara Thorne, starting from that particular Wednesday. "You bought Harlow's," Clara said. "Not a question." "I did. And you had the owner removed. Restructured." Julian. There was a pause. Julian, in his office on the 40th floor of the Vance Industries building, turned his chair to face the window in the gray Seattle skyline. He said nothing. "I told you," Clara said, "that I would think about help. That doesn't mean Higgins cost you your job," he said, "as a direct consequence of intervening in a situation I was involved in. That is a liability I intend to address." That sounds like a business argument. It is also a business argument. What's the other kind of argument? He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a large, empty house. A professional kitchen that has never been properly used. A guest suite that is heated and furnished and sitting vacant. And Lily is cold." A pause. "That is the other kind of argument." Clara was quiet. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to accept a reasonable professional arrangement that happens to also address a practical problem. You can audit my motives while you're doing it. You're aware," said Clara, "that this is an insane offer from a man I've met once." "You're aware," said Julian, "that you were about to figure out how to cover 6 weeks of school fees on $340. The silence stretched. "How do you know about the school fees?" Clara said. "Marcus is very thorough." "Tell Marcus," said Clara, "that his thoroughness is alarming." Noted. Is that a yes? Another silence. Clara looked at Gerald the rabbit. 2 weeks trial, she said. I see the full employment contract before we move a single bag, and I maintain the right to leave at any point, for any reason, with no financial obligation. Done. And Lily keeps her school place. Already arranged. And nobody, not you, not Marcus, not your driver, talks to Lily about money or circumstances or Clara. His voice was very quiet. I know what it is to be a child who can feel the weight of everyone around them managing information carefully. I won't do that to her. Something in Clara's chest went still. Okay, she said. The same word Lily had used in the school office. The same measured, considered, real okay. The house was obscene. That was Clara's first thought, standing in the entryway of Julian's Belltown residence with Lily's hand in hers and 2 bags at her feet, looking up at the double-height ceiling and the floating staircase and the floor-to-ceiling windows through which the Seattle skyline was visible in its entirety like a personal exhibit. The house was 4 stories, glass and dark steel and warm-toned wood, and it was beautiful in the way that curated, flawlessly maintained spaces are beautiful, completely, and without a single human mess. There were no books on the floor, no drawings on the refrigerator, no mismatched curtains made from 2 complementary sheets. Every surface was perfect and impersonal in the manner of a luxury hotel or an architectural photograph, a space that had been designed to impressive effect but hadn't yet been lived in. Lily looked around with wide eyes and said nothing for a full minute. Then, it's very clean. It is, Clara agreed. Like a museum, but with couches. Julian, descending the staircase, he had changed from his work clothes into something darker and less formal, though less formal was a relative term, heard this and stopped 2 steps from the bottom. Something crossed his face that was almost a wince. Your rooms are on the 2nd floor, he said. East wing. Marcus has the details. He's nervous, Lily told Clara, in a whisper that carried completely. Clara pressed her lips together. Julian's expression remained indeterminate. The first week was a careful, circling process of 2 careful people testing the dimensions of each other's boundaries. Julian was in the house intermittently, mostly at night, mostly after 10 p.m., sometimes not at all, which Marcus explained meant he was working through the night in his office downtown. When he was there, he existed in his study or the living room like a piece of elegant furniture, present, functional, and not requiring engagement. Clara cooked. She had always cooked well, in the way that people who learn to make a lot from a little develop genuine skill through necessity. In Julian's kitchen, with its 6-burner range and its pantry stocked by a weekly delivery service, she cooked the way she'd always cooked, which was to say simply and with care. Soup on cold evenings. Roast chicken on Sundays. The smells moved through the house and changed its quality, the way warmth changes a room you've been cold in, gradually, then all at once. On the 5th evening, she found Julian standing at the kitchen doorway, watching her chop vegetables. Sit down, she said, without turning around. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. I didn't sit. He sat. Not because he was accustomed to being told where to sit in his own kitchen. He was not. But because the word had been issued with the easy, unthinking authority of someone for whom feeding people was simply what you did. An argument would have been absurd. Lily appeared from her homework at the kitchen table and climbed, without preamble or permission, into the chair beside him. I'm learning long division, she announced. Is it going well? He asked. Not really, she said honestly. Do you know long division? Julian Vance, who had built a technology empire valued at $11 billion on a foundation of applied mathematics, said, I know some. Okay, said Lily, and pushed her homework toward him. That was the beginning. Julian's insomnia was well documented by his doctor, by Marcus, by the 3 sleep specialists he had consulted over the years and whose recommendations he had acknowledged and ignored. He averaged 4 hours on a good night. He had not, in recent memory, slept until morning without pharmaceutical assistance. On the 9th night after Clara and Lily moved in, he was in his bedroom at 11:45, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at the ceiling in the specific way that insomniacs stare at ceilings. Not peacefully, but with the tense resignation of someone bracing for another 6 hours of not sleeping. Through the wall, he heard Clara's voice. She was telling Lily a story, the words too quiet to make out fully, drifting through the old house's less than perfect sound insulation as a soft murmur. rising and falling with the cadence of something told not from a book, but from memory or imagination. The voice moved through the dark like water finding its level, unhurried, warm, real. Julian put his arm over his eyes. He woke at 6:47 in the morning with no memory of falling asleep. He lay very still for a long moment, disoriented by the quality of the light. Too much of it, too late, the kind of light that belongs to a full night's sleep and not a 4-hour stretch. The ceiling of his bedroom was bright. The house was quiet. He had slept 8 hours. He went very carefully to the kitchen, moving through the house in the manner of a man carrying something fragile, and made himself coffee and sat at the kitchen counter and looked at the city and said nothing for a long time. When Clara appeared at 7:15, Lily at her heels and both of them in their morning state. Lily's hair spectacular, Clara's expression still assembling itself. She found him at the counter with his coffee and his peculiar stillness, and she stopped. "You look different," she said. "I slept," he said. A pause. She looked at him, the real, assessing look that she reserved for things she was trying to understand. Then she went to the coffee machine. "Good," she said. Simple and without theater. Julian looked at his coffee cup and thought that good was exactly the right word for it. It was a Tuesday evening in the house's third week when the conversation happened. The real one, the one that neither of them had been steering toward but had been, perhaps, approaching since the afternoon a helicopter landed in a school courtyard and two people recognized each other across a chasm of circumstance. Lily had gone to bed early, tired from a school project. Clara was at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and a book she wasn't really reading, and Julian had come downstairs in the manner he sometimes did late in the evenings, not seeking company exactly, but not avoiding it either, and sat on the other side of the table with his own cup and a silence that had, over 3 weeks, become the comfortable kind. "You have scars," Clara said. She said it quietly and without preamble, because she had seen them 2 weeks earlier when he'd come downstairs in a fitted t-shirt. Old scars, vertical and patterned on his shoulder blades in a way that didn't suggest accident, and she had put the observation away and waited for the moment it wanted to be spoken. Julian went still. "Not asking," Clara said, "just saying I noticed, and that it doesn't matter what you say or don't say." A long silence. The city was quiet outside. The rain, which had been threatening all day, started up again in its patient Seattle way. "I was 7 the first time," he said finally. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had built an empire, that had signed documents and shaken hands and had never needed to explain themselves to anyone. Third foster placement. There was a coat. It got burned on the stove. A pause. I was cold. I reached across the burner for something. The sleeve caught. Clara said nothing. She was very still. It wasn't even bad. The burn, I mean. But the coat was ruined, and he stopped. Started again, from a different direction. "When I saw Lily's dress," he said, "in the courtyard, the way she was holding the torn piece. That's specific." He pressed his lips together. "The way you hold something that someone else made for you, and that's been destroyed. Like it's somehow your fault." Clara's throat moved. "That's why," he said. "That's why I know," she said softly. "I know." He looked at her. She was watching him with the direct, unapologetic empathy of someone who has also carried something heavy and knows that the worst thing you can offer a person carrying something heavy is the performance of sympathy rather than the reality of it. "Lily would have been fine," Clara said, after a moment. "Eventually. She's remarkably resilient. I've tried to give her enough security that the bad things don't." She stopped. "But sometimes I think the reason she doesn't break is because she knows I'll break first to prevent it, and she's trying to prevent that too. Two people each trying not to be the one who breaks first." "That's exhausting," he said. "It is," she said. And then, "But it's also us. It's the thing we've built." She looked at her tea. "I don't want to be fixed, Julian. I want you to understand that. I'm not a situation to be resolved." "I know you're not." "Then what is this?" She met his eyes, steady and real. He looked back at her with the same steadiness, and after a moment said with a simplicity that was more honest than any more elaborate answer could have been, "I don't know yet, but I don't want it to stop." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, warm, deliberate. "Okay," she said. The article appeared on a Thursday morning, on the city's most widely read gossip and society blog. a publication that occupied the uncomfortable middle ground between journalism and cruelty and had always operated there cheerfully. The headline read, "Billionaire Julian Vance's new household manager, a calculated seduction?" It was thorough in its insinuations, careful in its legally defensible word choices, and devastating in its implications. Clara Thorne was described, with smiling specificity, as a struggling young woman with a tragic backstory and a convenient younger sister who provided the perfect emotional hook. Julian's intervention at the school was recharacterized as a grooming narrative, and Lily, quiet, careful, 8-year-old Lily, was described as having been removed from Oak Ridge Academy following an incident involving property belonging to other students. A theft accusation, unnamed sources, the specific cowardice of anonymous malice. Marcus had the article on Julian's desk by 7 a.m. and the source identified by 8. Agatha Higgins had spent 3 weeks cultivating a member of the school's board of directors, a man named Castellan, who had his own financial irregularities to protect and had decided that the best defense was an offense. Together, they had fed the information to the blog's editor with the careful precision of people who understood exactly how much damage was possible from exactly the right story at exactly the right time. Julian read the article twice. The second time, the muscle in his jaw was working in the way that Marcus had come to associate with outcomes that were comprehensive and final. He looked at his phone. No call yet from Clara. Then his phone rang. Clara's voice, when she called him, was controlled. Carefully, almost frighteningly controlled. The voice of someone who has decided how they will manage their own devastation. "I've seen it," she said. "Clara, I've seen it, and I've thought about it, and I need." Her breath was audible. "I need to leave. I need to take Lily and go. Before this gets worse, before your reputation is, don't." "Julian, I'm not. I'm not doing this dramatically. I'm being practical. I'm trying to, Clara." His voice was very quiet. "Please don't make a decision about this right now. Please give me 24 hours. A long silence. He could hear Lily's voice somewhere in the background, distant, unaware, talking about breakfast. "She doesn't know yet," Clara said. "I know. She can't. She cannot know that someone said she stole. She won't know." His voice was firm. 24 hours. "Can you give me that?" Another silence. Then, 24 hours. Marcus had prepared the press conference for 15 years without knowing he was preparing it. Every document, every record, every carefully maintained file that Julian Vance had accumulated on the institutions and individuals that had shaped his life. He had kept them not from nostalgia, but from the instinct of a man who had learned early that the world was not just, and therefore documentation was armor. The press conference was called for Friday at 11 a.m. at the Vance Industries building. The invitations went out at 9 p.m. Thursday to every major news outlet in the city, every national wire service, and specifically and by name, to the editor of the blog that had published the story. The legal team worked through the night. By Friday morning, Julian had affidavits from 6 current and former Oak Ridge students documenting years of targeted treatment towards scholarship children. He had 3 years of financial records demonstrating that Castellan had been diverting small sums from the school's scholarship endowment, modest individually, significant in aggregate, into a private account. He had Higgins's employment record from a previous school, where a similar complaint had been buried by a sympathetic headmaster who was a friend of her husband's. He had a security camera recording from the open house, provided by a parent who had filmed the entire incident on a phone and hadn't known what to do with it until Marcus called them personally and explained exactly what it would be used for. Marcus set it all up. The conference room, the screens, the folders for the press. Julian stood at the window before it started, looking at the city in the gray morning light. Clara was at home with Lily. He had asked her not to watch the live stream. She had said she would consider it, which meant she was already watching. He turned from the window. The room was full when he walked in. The cameras were running. Julian walked to the podium with the particular quality of stillness that he carried into rooms where something conclusive was about to happen. No performance, no preparation visible, simply presence and certainty. He did not greet the room. He began. 3 weeks ago, he said, an 8-year-old girl named Lily Thorne was removed from her school's open house event and placed in the rain because her teacher disapproved of the dress she was wearing. The dress had been made by Lily's sister, who sews by lamplight to avoid waking Lily when she works late. He looked directly at the cameras. I witnessed this. This is a fact. He paused. This week, a story was published suggesting that Lily had stolen property at her school. This is a lie designed and disseminated by two individuals who are angry that their cruelty was exposed and who targeted an 8-year-old child to conduct their anger because they are, fundamentally, cowards. The room was very quiet. My legal team is providing to every journalist in this room a complete package of documentation. You will find evidence of financial misconduct by a member of Oak Ridge Academy's board of directors. You will find evidence of a pattern of targeted mistreatment of scholarship students spanning several years. You will find the source of Thursday's article, with the communications that confirm it was fabricated. He paused. Those responsible will be meeting with law enforcement this afternoon. I have been informed that they are aware of this. He looked at the room. I want to say something that is not a legal statement. He paused, a different kind of pause, less calculated. The women at the center of this story are not my employees. They are not a charity project. They are not a narrative. He looked at the cameras. Clara Thorne is 24 years old. She gave up her own education to raise her sister. She works 3 jobs. She sews dresses by lamplight. She is the most capable, honest, and courageous person I have met in my adult life. Another pause. Lily Thorne is 8 years old, and she has done nothing wrong. Not now, not ever, and anyone who prints otherwise will hear from attorneys who are very good at their jobs. He straightened. I do not have a prepared closing statement, he said. I will say this. These women are my family. I protect my family. Questions. The room erupted. Clara watched on her laptop at the kitchen table, Lily at school, a cold cup of tea beside her hand, and when he said these women are my family, she pressed her fist to her mouth and held very, very still. She did not cry until he called her afterward. His voice as controlled as always, but with something underneath it that was the opposite of controlled, and he said, Are you all right? And she said, You idiot. He paused. Is that a positive assessment? It's a terrified one, she said. You just told the entire city. I know what I told the entire city. And you're okay with, I said what was true, he said simply. I'm always okay with that. Clara was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. And then, because it was true and she had stopped performing the parts of herself that required her to pretend otherwise. Thank you for not letting us go. I wasn't going to, he said. Not for any reason. Lily turned 9 years old on a Saturday in late November, when Seattle had decided to be briefly, brilliantly sunny. Julian had asked Clara, 3 weeks earlier, if he could plan the birthday party. He'd asked with the specific, slightly awkward diffidence of a man who has decided to want something he doesn't know how to want, and Clara had looked at him for a long moment and said yes, with the caveat that Lily's actual friends from school were invited, and it was not to be a production. It was a production, not aggressively. Julian had understood the caveat better than Clara had expected and had calibrated accordingly. The house was decorated not with the hired minimalist perfection of a catered event, but with the kind of organized chaos that suggested someone had actually thought about what a 9-year-old would find delightful. Fairy lights in the stairwell, balloons in Lily's favorite colors, yellow and purple. She had mentioned this once and Julian had filed it. A cake made by a genuinely excellent baker who had been given the brief. 9-year-old who liked space and yellow things, and had produced a 3-tier cake depicting the solar system with edible glitter and a small sugar rocket ship orbiting the top tier. Lily's friends from school, 8 of them, various ages, one of whom had apparently also cried about the blog article without fully understanding it and had told Lily she was brave, which Lily had reported to Clara with bemusement, arrived at noon and proceeded to do what children do at parties when they're actually having a good time, which is to say they ran and yelled and ate too much cake and forgot to be impressed by the venue. Marcus organized the games with the dedication of a man who had waited 17 years for an occasion to deploy his enthusiasm. Julian stood at the edge of things and watched, and his face, which had an extensive vocabulary of control and composure, did something more complex, something that was, when Clara quietly observed it from across the room, recognizably close to joy. After the cake, after the friends had gone home in a cheerful chaos of retrieved coats and leftover goodie bags, Julian called Lily into the living room. I have something for you, he said. It isn't a substitute for what was taken from you. It's not meant to be. But I wanted, he stopped. Julian Vance, who had delivered keynote addresses to 10,000 people without visible nerves, stopped and gathered himself in front of a 9-year-old girl. I asked your sister for the original design. Clara, standing in the doorway, folded her arms around herself. I found a designer who works with historical and traditional textile construction, Julian continued. I gave him the design and he built it properly, from the right materials, the way it was supposed to be made. He lifted the box from the coffee table and set it in front of Lily. Lily opened it. The dress was yellow, not the washed-out yellow of old cotton, but a warm, rich, deliberate yellow, the color of late afternoon sunlight. The silhouette was exactly what Clara had made, simple, childlike, clean-lined. But the fabric was silk-cotton blend, soft and substantial, and at the hem and collar, the designer had worked in tiny seed pearls and fragments of crystal that caught the light and distributed it in small, scattered sparks along the skirt. Not a costume, not a display. A dress for a child who deserved to be dressed like exactly what she was, someone precious and loved and worth the care. Lily looked at it for a very long time. Then she looked up at Julian, and her expression was the specific expression of a child who has more feeling than she has words for and is deciding which of the feelings to lead with. She got up from the couch. She walked to him with the careful, deliberate steps of someone approaching something important, and she wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face into his chest, the same way she pressed her face into Clara's stomach on the morning of the open house, with the same fisted hands and the same total, unconditional surrender to the feeling. Julian's arms, after a moment that lasted a very particular kind of forever, came around her. "Thank you, Dad," Lily said, quietly, without theater, the most natural thing in the world. The word landed in Julian's chest like something falling from a great height and finding, finally, the ground. Marcus, in the hallway, turned to look very carefully at the wallpaper. Clara, in the doorway, pressed her fingers over her mouth and let her eyes do what they were going to do. And Julian, who had not cried in 27 years, who had sealed the part of himself that cried into a room he'd stopped trying to open, found, without warning and without recourse, that the room had opened. He held Lily, and his eyes burned, and a single tear tracked down the rigid line of his jaw and fell into her hair. He made no sound. He just held on. Spring came to Seattle the way it usually did, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a gradual, negotiated brightening, rain softening into mist, gray dissolving at its edges into pale blue, the cherry trees on the residential streets blooming with the cheerful insistence of something that cannot be delayed indefinitely. The house had changed. It was still beautiful. The floating staircase and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the dark steel and warm wood were all still there, but it had been supplemented, in the way that living spaces are supplemented by living people, with the evidence of inhabitation. Books on the floor, some of them Lily's with broken spines from rereading, some of them Clara's with a single bookmark, some of them Julian's with margin notes in his cramped, precise handwriting. A drawing on the refrigerator. Lily had done a portrait of the three of them, which was artistically ambitious and anatomically creative, and which Julian had taped up himself on a Saturday morning without comment. Clara's sewing things on the table in the second sitting room, which had been claimed as a workspace with such natural authority that no one had thought to negotiate it. One of Julian's expensive throw blankets relocated permanently to the reading chair by the window because Lily fell asleep in it with books, and he had stopped returning the blanket to where it belonged. Gerald the rabbit was still on the ceiling of their old apartment, presumably, but the apartment was someone else's now. Marcus Sterling threw a spring dinner party. This was technically his initiative. He had taken note of certain atmospheric conditions in the house over the preceding months and had decided, as Julian's assistant and as his oldest friend, that some catalysts require external application. He arranged it with the same thoroughness with which he arranged everything. A table in the garden, which Julian hadn't known he had until Marcus identified it on the property survey, cleared and set with fairy lights and real flowers. A catered dinner, so that Clara, for once, wasn't the one cooking. Lily, strategically, was at a sleepover at her school friend Sophie's house, arranged with Sophie's mother with the efficiency of a diplomat brokering a treaty. Julian found Clara at the garden table alone with a glass of wine, the last of the lights still warm in the western sky, and sat across from her. They talked for a long time. About the past year. About how strange and improbable it was that a helicopter had landed on a school lawn and changed the shape of things. About Lily, who was thriving, who had been re-enrolled at Oak Ridge under new leadership, and who had been named this semester's junior science fair winner for a project on planetary formation that had been, by all accounts, extraordinary. About Clara's plan to re-enroll in university in the autumn, part-time initially, online, in a program that Julian had happened to mention was very well reviewed while appearing not to be directing her toward it. About the small, specific, daily pleasures of the past 6 months that had accumulated, without anyone quite designing them to, into something that looked very much like a life. The stars came out. Marcus appeared briefly to top up the wine and then vanished with the practiced invisibility of a man who knows when he is not required. Julian reached into his jacket pocket. He put the ring on the table between them. It was not a large ring. He had thought about this carefully and had understood that large would be wrong. That what was right was something that looked like a promise rather than a transaction. A single stone, warm and clear, in a simple gold setting. Something that would fit a hand that had sewn dresses by lamplight and made smiley faces from crackers and folded its own life down small to make room for someone else's. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I should point out," she said, in the voice that had first made him sit down in his own kitchen when told to, "that I've known you for approximately 8 months. I know, and that I am not a person who makes decisions impulsively. I know that too, and that Lily is going to be absolutely insufferable about this. I have already reconciled myself to that." Clara looked at the ring. The garden was quiet around them, and the city glowed at its edges, and somewhere across the city, Lily was asleep at Sophie's house, full of birthday cake memories and planetary knowledge and the deep, uncomplicated security of a child who has been given back the one thing that poverty and cruelty had tried to take from her, the simple, radical knowledge that she was safe. Clara picked up the ring. She turned it in the light for a moment, watching it catch the stars. "Yes," she said, not dramatically, not with performance, with the same direct, unambiguous honesty she brought to everything. The word dropping into the quiet night like a stone into still water, steady and clear and real. Julian's expression, always so carefully composed, did the thing that it had been doing more and more often lately, the thing that Marcus had identified as a smile, and which was, in fact, more accurately described as a man remembering that the world contains warmth and that he is allowed to be in it. He reached across the table and took her hand. The wedding was in October, when the city was in full autumn, gold and amber, and the particular low light that makes Seattle look, on its better days, like a painting of itself. Lily walked down the aisle as the flower girl with the grave, radiant dignity of a child who has been given a job of great importance and intends to do it properly. She wore yellow. The dress, her dress, the one from the box, the one with the seed pearls and the scattered light, had been altered slightly to accommodate 9 months of growth and was more beautiful than ever. She scattered rose petals in exact, deliberate handfuls, measuring them as she went with the precision of a future scientist who had already decided that everything worth doing was worth doing correctly. When she reached the front of the aisle, she turned to find her seat and found, instead, Julian's hand extended toward her. She took it, stood beside him, looked up. "Ready?" she whispered. "No," he said honestly. "But that's okay." "It's okay," she agreed, with complete authority. Clara came down the aisle in a dress she had designed herself. Of course she had. In a deep ivory that made the autumn light look like it had arranged itself around her. She walked toward them, toward Julian and Lily standing side by side with their hands linked, and her face was the face of someone who has arrived somewhere they thought might not exist. The ceremony was short, because Julian had said he wanted real things said and no performance, and the officiant had understood immediately. The vows were brief and honest. Julian held Clara's hands throughout and looked at her with the expression that had no name in his old vocabulary and which had since acquired one. The word was home, and it was both noun and verb, both place and act. When it was over, Lily, who had been maintaining the solemnity of the occasion with considerable effort, abandoned the effort entirely and flung herself between them, grabbing both their hands, and tilted her face up to the October sky. "Okay," she announced, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the universe in general, to whatever calculus governs the distribution of joy, the settling of debts between suffering and relief, the way things that break are sometimes rebuilt into something better. Okay, good. 3 broken people, 1 yellow dress, and a helicopter that landed on a perfectly manicured lawn at exactly the right moment. Some things, it turns out, are worth being furious about. And some things, the right things, the real things, the things made by bleeding hands in the dark, are worth protecting with everything you have. The sunshine, when it finally comes, is worth every drop of rain.